Good morning. Good morning. I have a question, probably common to most of us. Have you ever lost something, big, small, minor, major, and you looked for it diligently and eventually found it, and think of the excitement, the joy that you had when you found it. Now it might be as simple, or I wouldn't say unimportant as a cell phone. Left it someplace, and then you go back, call department store or Starbucks, wherever you thought you might have left it, or your credit card. And these are pretty valuable things, if you ever have. I know I've thought I misplaced a credit card and left it someplace, but I found it somewhere in the car. And back in the old days, when some of us used to work on our cars and repair the carburetors, when cars had carburetors, we'd buy carburetor kits with a lot of little parts in it, springs and gaskets and bearings and different things that needed to repair, rebuild the carburetor. I've done this a few times way back in the 70s and 80s. And if you lost one of those, dropped one of those little screws or bolts or bearings or something, you couldn't complete the job. So you look, and almost, actually sometimes ask God, please help me find this little part because I can't complete the job. And eventually find it. And it's a certain sense of relief and joy. And let's take it up another level. Those of us who are parents, when we had little children, you're in a grocery store, department store, and you think your 2 or 3-year-old child is right next to you, and you look around, all of a sudden, he or she's gone. You look the next aisle, not there, and you start getting this feeling of panic. I know I've had this happen a couple times. Fortunately, it was only for a few minutes, and then he or she shows up, and what a tremendous relief. And of course, we can go on up from there, from people who have had children, maybe cases where you've had some people have had mentally ill family members who live on the streets, and you don't hear from them for 6 months or a year at a time. And you think the worst sometimes, but then you hear from them one day, and what a tremendous relief, a sense of joy. Well, just keep that thought for a moment, that sense of rejoicing and relief when you find something that is lost. And we'll see that Jesus had something very important to say on that topic. When Jesus was on earth, he was criticized for a number of things. Of course, the most major thing that he was criticized for was his relationship with his Father, calling God his Father. We see many cases where he was threatened. They tried to stone him and eventually crucified him because of that claim to that relationship with God. And another area that he was strongly criticized for frequently was because he associated with people, common people, outcasts of society that some thought he shouldn't be associating with, especially as a teacher, as a leader in the religious community. He was accepted for that by some. So we see a prime example of that in Luke 15, and that's the only place I'm going to refer to today scripturally. Luke 15. We're going to see an example of this criticism where Jesus was criticized directly for his association with the people that he associated with. And we'll see what his answer was. A very profound answer. In fact, he takes the full, basically next 30 verses in Luke to explain why he associated with them. So if you want to turn to Luke, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter, I'm just going to refer to parts of it. We'll see how he answered his critics in this very important area. Verses 1 and 2 says that tax collectors and sinners were all crowding around to listen to Jesus. Those are the people that came to him to hear what he had to say. So also the Pharisees and teachers of the law of Moses started grumbling. They came to hear what he was saying as well. But they weren't focusing on the message. They were focusing on the other people that were there also. And they said, this man is friendly with sinners. He even eats with them. Boy, that's bad. But that's Jesus' nature, wasn't it? His habit to associate with people that others didn't want to. He fed them, he healed them, he taught them. He had a lot of compassion on the people of society that some of the higher-ups in society felt he should not be associating with. Let's look quickly at the background to see why the Pharisees and teachers were so harsh with him on this particular situation. See, the Pharisees had strict rules about those who didn't keep the law. Anyone who didn't keep the law, which was the law of Moses, were considered sinners, just blank sinners, especially those who weren't Jewish or of their particular group. They were called the people of the land. And that's kind of another term of common people, sinners. And in fact, the Jewish society at that time, especially the Pharisees and the teachers, they, of course, wouldn't allow any kind of intermarriage, no business association with these people. They wouldn't invite them as guests in their home, nor would they be a guest in their home. But we see Jesus, did associate quite a bit. So Jesus goes on to answer them right away in verse 3. We'll see how he answers them. In fact, we're going to see 3 parables, 2 very short ones and a little longer one. But they all have the same theme. They're all interrelated. The first one, then Jesus told them a story. If any of you has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will you do? Won't you leave the 99 in the field and go look for the lost sheep until you find it? And when you find it, you will be so glad that you will put it on your shoulders and carry it home. Then you will call on your friends and neighbors and say, let's celebrate. I found my lost sheep. Jesus said, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous who don't need to repent. That was the first example explaining why he spent time with these people. Obviously, it didn't sink in right away. Think of the setting now for this particular parable. A shepherd watching over a herd of sheep. Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that because most people didn't own their own flock of sheep. In a lot of the villages, it was a communal flock. And so the flock, no matter what size it was owned by the small village. All the people had an interest in it, so they would probably take shifts in watching these sheep at night because 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they had to be watched. Sheep are that way. So there might have been 2 or 3 people out there, men, watching these sheep, and noticed one was gone, so he goes and takes off and to find that, no matter what it took to find that sheep. And the others watched the remaining sheep because he realized he did not want to lose one sheep, even one, on his watch, because it was all part of a community, and every sheep was very, very valuable. Of course, the conclusion of this, which we can look back and see quite easily, that sinners that Jesus associated with represented the one lost sheep. But this is actually, it was a saying apparently back at that time. The Jews said that there would be joy in heaven over one sinner who is obliterated. That was their concept. That's why this message that Jesus gave them was so profound and strong. But he wasn't leaving it there with one little parable, because there wasn't much response probably to that. So he went on again, beginning in verse 8 to 10. So Jesus told the people another story. What will a woman do if she has 10 silver coins and loses one of them? Won't you light a lamp, sweep the floor, and look carefully until she finds it? Then she will call in her friends and neighbors and say, let's celebrate. I found the coin I lost. Jesus said, in the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Again, the same conclusion as was given in the first parable. Now, a little background here helps understand the coin. It wasn't just a dime fell out of her pocket or purse, whatever, it's on the floor, let's go find it and get all excited about it. However, the coin could have represented different things. It could have been, for instance, one drachma, which is, comparatively equal to about 1 day's wages back at that time. And so they needed that just to eat. So in that sense, losing a coin of value like that was a lot. And finding a coin on the floor in most of those houses wasn't that easy. They were usually earthen floors, maybe with some straw, other materials to kind of, add something to the floor. So trying to find a lost coin, sweeping it, it was quite a project. She may have needed to have help. Another theory on what this coin might have represented, perhaps even more valuable than in the first situation. When a woman was married, she, as part of a dowry or part of proof that she was married, she would have a headdress consisting of 10 silver coins. And they were held together with a chain of some sort. And so this was a very valuable thing for her. And to lose one of those was very important. It's like losing your wedding ring in one sense. So again, that was a very valuable thing. So when she found that, it was a cause for celebration. And so she would tell her neighbors, because they were also concerned. So again, the same conclusion that we had in the first parable, that there's joy in heaven over one repentant sinner. That's what Jesus said it was. Now, this concept of looking for sinners, like looking for coins or sheep, was something new to the Jewish thought at that time. They didn't believe that God went out looking for sinners, looking for man, looking for the least of men to come to him. They believed that men had to basically crawl to God in pity, asking for forgiveness. This was a new concept that Jesus brought. This is part of, we'll see, is part of the new covenant, something that Jesus taught that was not taught before. It was different than their understanding at that time. So after two occasions of parables that basically said the same thing, different examples, which the people at that time, of course, understood. He always uses examples that people can understand, they can relate to. It's nothing far out intellectual, but very basic. So he goes on to one more example, if the first two didn't get the point across. Now this third parable has been referred to as the parable of the lost son, the parable of the two sons, the prodigal son, even the prodigal father. Because as we'll see, the emphasis really is on the father more so than the lost son. But that is certainly an integral part of it. This has been called the greatest story in the world because it's so well known, has such a profound message that all of us can relate to, and brings a great deal of joy when we fully understand what it means, especially in our relationship with God. It starts in verse 11, and I'm not going to read the whole account here, but I'll paraphrase parts of it. Jesus also told them another story. Once a man had two sons. The younger said to the father, "Give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Now, a little bit of background is called for here as well. For a son to go and ask his father for a share of estate while the father was still alive, he wasn't retired yet, he was still, alive and well, was extreme disrespect. It was not considered something you do at all back in society at that time. It was almost like saying, "Dad, you're still with you. You're not dying quick enough or something. I want my money now so I can enjoy it while I'm still young enough." And so that was considered a disgraceful thing to do. In fact, children who would do that would also sometimes be disinherited or driven away from the home because it was so disrespectful. But we see in this case, the father complied. Now, there were two sons, and as the rules of inheritance applied at that time, the oldest son got 2/3 of the inheritance, the younger son got 1/3. So the younger son got basically 1/3 of the inheritance. Now, to turn this inheritance, all these properties that the father and the family owned, into something he could give the son, he basically had to either have a lot of cash on hand that was equivalent to 1/3 of the total property ownings, or he had to maybe sell part of the property, which is basically unheard of. They just didn't do that. Even though after 50 years maybe it would come back through the Jubilee year. Or he may have mortgaged it to get the cash to pay off the son, so the son could take his inheritance and leave town. So verse 13 continues the story. Not long after the younger son got together all he had, he set off for a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. So I'll kind of summarize from there. He was out there blowing all his money, life was great, and had what he wanted to, and the means to do it. But then a famine came in the land, and times weren't so good anymore. He spent all of his money. Good jobs weren't available anymore. So he had to accept whatever he could get, and that was with a farmer feeding this farmer's pigs. And apparently, room and board did not come along with feeding these pigs. In fact, he got pretty hungry and actually wished he could have eaten some of the food that the pigs were eating. So after all of this experience, he came to his senses and decided to go home. And that was a pretty major thing to come to and to think about doing that. You know, the pride of this young man, knowing what he did, knowing how disgraceful it was. Verse 20 says, "So he got up and went home to his father. But while he was a far way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." Now you can think of this father. It appears that he was maybe spent every part of every day out there standing, not just rocking on in a chair on the porch, but he was out by the gates. Maybe he was beyond the gates, looking down the road, saying, "Well, maybe today's the day he's going to finally come home, come to his senses." And sure enough, he recognized him a long ways off. And those of us who have kids or family or parents, whatever, we recognize how our family members walk. And so perhaps that's why he recognized his son from far off, even though he's probably lost all the clothes that he had, the good ones, and was dressed pretty shabbily, and maybe didn't look like his son in some ways, but he saw the way he moved and walked. He says, "My son is finally coming home." And another thing to note on the situation here, it says the father ran out to meet his son. In society at that time, older men of status especially did not run. They didn't lift up their robes and run. Younger men did, girls did, so forth, maybe, and women, but older men of status did not run. So he was really excited. You think of the excitement, the joy that he had at this time, going out to see his son who had finally returned. Verses 21 through 22, the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Again, of course, this ties in directly with the first two parables, giving essentially the same message, but amplifying the joy, the consequences, the event that took place. A little note here, too, on the things that the father said, bring the robe. Well, a robe at that time meant honor, and by the robe was probably the father's chief robe that he used for celebrating holy events and so forth. But it was the best robe in the house. It represented honor. The ring you put on his finger represented authority. He was giving his son, again, authority to be in the family, authority to be whatever a son of a man of this status would be. And the shoes, of course, represent freedom for the children of the family, because a lot of the servants did not wear shoes. It was not easy for them to get far away from home. But shoes was a part of being a part of that family. So he was welcomed back into the family with honor, authority, and acknowledged as a child of the family, as a son of the family in good standing. And of course, we realize what happened then. I'm not going to read all of that, whereas the older brother refused to come in and celebrate, enjoy this return of his brother. And so even though he was invited in, he refused to come in. So what happens next? The father had to go out and talk to the older son and explain to the older son why they were celebrating. And he says, "My son," the farmer said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Again, that same thing. Something was lost, we search for it, and it's found. And the brother couldn't accept it. He wasn't willing to celebrate, wasn't willing to acknowledge that a son could come to this place, repent, and be willing to come home, and then be accepted by the father of all things. Abraham Lincoln was asked one time how he would treat the Southerners when the war was finally over. And I thought this was interesting. He says, "I would treat them as if they had never been away." And that's exactly what he did. That's why he was such a great president, the way he treated people, even after they rebelled and wanted to destroy the nation over issues. That's why I like to, as I mentioned earlier, I think a better title for this particular parable is The Loving Father, as opposed to the prodigal son. Some call it the prodigal father, because prodigal actually means very generous, willing to give everything, not just spend everything and take everything, but it implies being super generous. And this is a good title for this parable, referring to the Father, because the focus is on him. And who is the Father, of course? God, represents God. The lost son basically represents all of us, all of the world, all of society, especially those who don't know God, who haven't learned the way, haven't found the way, or following the way that Jesus brought. And the older son, of course, represents the Pharisees of society, those who judge, who condemn others because they're not the same way or not as good as they are. So again, in summarizing, again, this is the answer that Jesus gave to the critics. Why are you hanging out with these people? Why are you so kind to these people? You feed them, you heal them, you teach them. And instead of spending time in the synagogue, arguing or whatever they do with the rest of them, like the intellectuals like to do sometimes in that society. So the main points, again, of these three parables, again, Jesus' answer to why he related to the outcasts of society is that something or someone is lost. It is sought after, it is found, and there's great rejoicing. Pretty simple formula. I think something we probably experience on some level most days of our lives, minor or major, whatever. But this is, of course, the most important example that we can possibly give, and Jesus gave it to these people that they didn't ask exactly. They didn't want the answer that he gave them, but he told them, this is why I hang out with these people. So after three examples, did the Pharisees understand why Jesus associated with the outcasts of society, with sinners, tax collectors, and so forth? And we see the answer is very simple. Jesus was with them so he could find and rescue lost people. And by the example of the parables, he showed them the mind of God. What was most important to God was finding, retrieving, and bringing these people to him. And what is a lost person? We talked about lost people. Is this who fits in that category? Well, it's someone who does not know the way, the message of the gospel. And all of us were in that category at one time. Maybe we thought we did. And but we've learned, we keep learning and growing. So there's a lot of people in that category. They don't know the way, and they aren't following the way, and they're not even aware that they are lost. And so how do people become lost? So I'm trying to carry this theme of what a lost person is and how we get there, and maybe look at ourselves and see where we're at in this. Well, there's three different ways a person can become lost. And those three different ways are given in the example of the parable. Like the sheep, through foolishness. We just do crazy things. Not deliberately, maybe not accidentally, but kind of victims of society and what we've inherited. So like the sheep, they don't smart enough to know that they do go here, they're going to get lost and need to get rescued. So another way people get lost is accidental, like the coin on the floor. It wasn't a deliberate act, it just fell, and it was hard to find. And some of us are left in that category as well. Some people in society are. They're led astray by circumstances, by the whole world scheme of things, politics and false teachings. It's just an accident. That's the way it happens. And thirdly, you see in the third parable that people are lost by deliberate actions. It was the son's deliberate action to decide to pack up and leave, and he knew it was wrong. It was pretty well ingrained in society at that time. But he did come to himself to understand. Okay, so what's the conclusion to all of this? What are we to do with this lesson today? And how does it relate to our church's purpose of being in unity with Christ and participating with him as he grows the kingdom of God? Well, first of all, we are in union or in unity with Jesus as we think like he does, as we think like God does. And how did they think? In the examples that we gave, compassion and a desire to find, search for the lost, and make them now found instead of lost. And also we participate with him by actually actively doing something to serve and help find the lost, to bring them in, to reveal the way of the gospel to them. We do it through, we do it here all the time. We have a food basket here, donating food, money to people. I'm not saying that the people that food is going to is lost, but it's part of participating in what God has called us to do, to reach people. And many of the people are lost because they don't know the way. They just they need our example, and they need our participation in actively helping them. We have other church activities that also go out and help people, and reach people, inviting people to share our meals with them. We donate for missionary programs. We witness in some way to our neighbors and family. That's all participating with Jesus, reaching the lost. In summary here, we don't know if those hearing Jesus' message that day really understood or agreed. The count doesn't say. It doesn't say, well, now the Pharisees went away and said, aha, now we understand why you... No, it didn't say that. But it's there for us today, because it's clear for us today what it meant. It's pretty obvious. And so we know then, by what's been recorded here, what we need to do with it.